You're listening to the first episode of the JustDjango Podcast. Firstly, I need to make a disclaimer. This is the first time I've done a podcast episode, and thanks to Murphy's Law, I had a few issues with audio during the recording. But that being said, for this first episode, I was grateful to be joined by Cory. Cory is a software developer and has been part of the indie hackers community for quite a while now. He's built many side projects, one of them being Saas Pegasus, which is a Django-powered SaaS template that you can use to bootstrap your projects. And you'll hear more about that in this episode. So thanks for tuning in. Consider giving it a review on Apple Podcasts and enjoy. Okay, Cory, thanks again for doing this with me. I'm going to get started on the Django side of things. So how did you get started with Django?
Yeah, absolutely. I first got started working with Django. It was definitely pre 1.0. So it was maybe 10 years ago or something like that. And I had never done any web development before. I was working professionally as the CTO of a company called Demogi that I worked for a long time. And we were primarily had been doing sort of like C# .NET applications and like mobile applications for at the time for like PDAs, like Palm Pilots and things like that. And we wanted to build our first web app. And we were looking at what was out there, and Rails was sort of the hot new thing that had just come out at that time, Ruby on Rails. And then Django was sort of just starting to sort of get more traction in the community and everything else. But one person on our team was a big Python aficionado, and also sort of followed all the latest tech trends and everything else. And he was like, no, we should use Django. Python's great. This is like going to be like the great like next big thing. And so he basically, we had this internal debate, but he sort of convinced our team that Django was the way to go. And so we launched that project with Django, and then sort of, fast forward 10 years, we just kept using it and it kept getting better. And we kept getting more and more familiar with it. And so, just kind of, I've dabbled in other tools and frameworks in the past, but I sort of keep coming back to Django, both because it's what I know best, and also because I haven't found anything that I like quite as much as it.
Could you talk a little about the size of your team and how your company did work with Django?
Yeah, so the whole team was probably like 4 or 5 people at the time, and we were doing a bunch of different projects. So actually, I think in the beginning, he just did his own project with Django. And then the next time it came up, I had a project that I was leading, and then I sort of took his lead and did it. So it actually started off as mostly like we would collaborate, but most projects had a single owner. And then over time, the company started doing less of a sort of like a project-based consulting and shifted more into like product-based stuff. And then we chose Django for our core product that the company ended up sort of investing a lot of resources in. And then that became over the course of the next 10 years, a big Django project with probably 20 some odd people working on it.
Okay, so in my experience, the team size for Django project has been 2, 3, or 1. Like really, really small. So that's nothing compared to having a 20-person team on a single Django project. To me, that's insane. How you even deal with clashing migrations, I can't imagine. Do you think with a larger team size that it's actually it's necessary? What would you recommend is actually a good team size for a moderate to large sized Django project?
Well, there's kind of no, I guess if you have a monolithic architecture, which we did, there's kind of no upper bound, I guess, right? Because if you've got a successful product and you're growing and you need to keep up with scaling challenges or new product development or feature requests or bug fixes or whatever, like you're gonna, I guess, scale your engineering team to meet whatever needs you have. You could make the case that a monolithic architecture is not a good choice above a certain size. But for us, we had sort of gotten to the point where we had the successful product and it was already a monolithic architecture, and starting to split it out into more components or microservices or something like that would have been tricky. And certainly, like, working in a 20-person team, comes with new challenges. At the same time, it's certainly possible, and we've developed a pretty good streamlined workflow that allows everybody to contribute and be productive, and we don't sort of clobber each other's work or migrations or anything like that. So I don't know if there is an ideal team size. I mean, certainly Django is great for small projects and for spinning up things quickly. But I think it can, scale arbitrarily, as evidenced by companies like Instagram and others that have built things on top of huge applications on top of Django.
So your work with Django, was it primarily using it? I know you say it's a monolithic app, but was it at all using the Django REST framework? Were you building APIs with it, or just
in this particular project, we were building APIs, but actually it's so old that it predated the period of time where Django REST framework was the obvious choice to use. So we built our APIs using a library called TastyPie, which was sort of a competing API library to Django REST framework, 7 odd years ago, before Django REST framework dominated. But the architecture was definitely more sort of like standard Django. Most pages are Django views and Django templates. We didn't have a lot of complex single page app type stuff in that particular project. And so the APIs, were occasionally used for certain workflows where it made sense, but a lot of the stuff was sort of normal, load the data in the view and render it in the template, that type of thing.
Okay. So for someone who's in the range of 3 to 5 years of experience, what would you recommend that they would add as the next skill or next thing that they should learn to kind of complement their Django skills?
Do you mean like a new framework or a new like something?
Yeah,
not
new technology,
Django?
Something not Django.
My personal opinion would be to go into sort of the front end area. So whether that's, a JavaScript framework like React or Vue, or also maybe some, UI stuff, CSS frameworks or that type of thing. But I think like Django, one of the things that I love about Django is that it can make a full stack developer like really, really powerful. And so if you've mastered Django, the next thing you'll want to do in order to build sort of better websites will be stuff on the front end, whether it's making things look better or complex single page apps and stuff like that. And so I recommend going in that route. And then they're basically a person who could do anything on the web, which is like a really powerful and very marketable skill set.
Right. So in your opinion, if you were looking at job candidates for potential role in your team, you would think that something in the front end would be like a standout skill to have, not something like Docker or Jenkins, other kind of build tools?
That's my own sort of personal preference, and in some ways I might bias more towards things that will make you able to deploy your own projects. And I'm a big advocate of sort of personal projects and side projects and things like that. And that's why I think like, you can deploy Django without Docker and Kubernetes
Sure.
and those other things. And if you're not sort of at a pretty substantial scale, you don't really need them. Whereas you can't deploy, a very nice site without having some design chops or
Right.
knowing a bit of JavaScript. That said, if your goal is to get a job at AWS or something like that, then probably focusing more on the DevOps side, and Docker and orchestration and that types of stuff would make sense. And of course, if you are just employed at a company, then I would imagine you'll upskill on whatever the company needs you to do. So for for that 20-person Django project I was describing, our biggest issues were consistently around scale and just sort of dealing with ever increasing volumes of data. And so a lot of our team got very good at the DevOps side using Ansible and like orchestration tools to quickly sort of spin up servers, doing things like database sharding and partitioning and all that type of infrastructure work, because that was what was needed by the project and by the company.
Okay. So this is kind of like a philosophical question, but maybe just to give you some context. When I consider my understanding of Django, I think I've gotten it down. I think I'm pretty good at it, but where it starts to fade is when you need to do really, really complex database queries. I'm not talking about basic filtering and queues and that's fine. But I mean, like when you really need to go into subqueries, and that's when it starts to be like, okay, I'm not really great there. But then at the same time, I'll ask myself, well, how many times do I ever need to do that? And it's kind of leaning towards zero most of the time.
Yeah.
So I wonder for people who are learning Django, because you always want to get better and you always want to understand more and more about the framework, but how deep do you go? So basically the question is like, how deep in the rabbit hole of understanding Django should you go? Because at some point I've seen you write about it, that you need to view code in a way that it's just a means to an end. You just want to achieve the business goal that you're aiming for. So what is your take on that? How far do you go?
I mean, that was going to be my answer, and it's pretty pragmatic, but it's exactly as far as you need to go and no further, right? Okay. So if you're dealing with some performance issue, and that in order to make your site performant, you're going to have to optimize the SQL query, and it's going to need to be some totally custom thing that Django can't handle, the ORM can't handle at all, or whatever, then you go in that deep. But I wouldn't have any reason to dive into the internals of any of that stuff or figure that out unless there was a business need for it. And I generally tend to apply that philosophy to everything I do, where you start with the problem and then you find the solution, as opposed to just sort of like educating yourself about solutions to problems that you may never have.
Sure. I think I completely agree with that, but I think it could be difficult for people who are trying to describe themselves as developers, because with that kind of mentality, then if you're just trying to build a really, really simple site, then there's not really a lot that you need to know. Like you can just scratch the surface and get the job done. But if you're trying to become a developer, a really skilled developer, you kind of need to go past basics and understand things a little bit deeper than what the average person, like pragmatic person, would understand. What can you say to that?
Well, I guess I would ask, like, to what end? Like, what is your, like, you want to become a developer to achieve some other goal, right? So that goal might be to get a high-paying job at a big corporate company. That goal might be to, have freedom and launch your own projects. It might be to get recognition in your community, or it might be to, help your parents troubleshoot their IT issues. But there's so whatever your goal is, I think you could optimize your learnings to serve that goal better. But the goal of being a developer is in and of itself, like that doesn't strike me as like a true goal. That's like a means to some other end.
Okay. So then, reflecting on everything you know now, do you have any regrets on going really strong into Django when you look at how Rails is done, and .NET and C#? Do you have any regrets?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's such a big world, and there's so much, there's so many different technologies out there to learn and to use, and I think for any period of time that I can sort of like keep in my head, I expect Django to be a very relevant and useful tool, regardless of whatever else the world is doing. And also, I think like, the more I've progressed in my career as a developer, the less that I feel that it's important, like that any particular piece of technology or framework or anything like that is important. And you see this to a huge extent these days in the JavaScript world, where things change so quickly and new frameworks spin up. Like I think React was barely a thing 5 years ago, and Vue was barely a thing 3 years ago, and so like I think when you're learning when you're learning Django or whatever it is, you are learning a lot about the specific way that Django has chosen to do things. But so much of that learning is also like, you may not realize it at the time, but it's very generalizable into like, oh, this is this is a way that templates work, and this is a way that people decide to do sort of like pre and post processing in a view, like with a middleware, with a context processor or something like that. And you can then take those principles that Django has chosen to do in a certain way and apply them to whatever sort of tool or language or framework that you then go on to next. And so I definitely wouldn't recommend that anybody pigeonhole themselves and identify solely as like, I am a Django developer, and I'll never touch Flask, and I'll never touch Ruby, and I'll never touch JavaScript. I think it's great to invest in Django and continue investing in Django to the extent that it's working for you. And then, if you do decide, to try out some other things, a lot of that inherent knowledge you'll realize you've gained is more widely applicable to any programming language or to any framework.
Right. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Yeah. So I actually came across you on Indie Hackers, and it was just by chance that you were also a Django developer, or were using Django in your projects, and particularly the Saas Pegasus project. So on the side of Indie Hackers, how did you actually come across it?
How did I come across Indie Hackers?
Yeah.
It's the short version of the story is that so this company I've been talking about, Damagi, in 2017, I decided to take a sabbatical. And in that sabbatical, I decided to try and make my own profitable internet businesses. And so I started just kind of Googling around and looking for articles, and Indie Hackers kept popping up. As at the time, it was a website that was just sharing the stories of successful, essentially bootstrap software businesses. And I thought it was really cool. I spent a lot of time there in the forums on the early days, sort of, when I was building my first project, my first solo project, doing the whole like, oh, check out my landing page, how does it look, and that type of thing. And yeah, I mean, it's a great resource for I think for developers to better understand all the other stuff that is involved in in launching a product that has nothing to do with software. So like the marketing and the sales and the SEO and all that type of stuff. And it's been a great community and resource for me for a while now.
Right. And since you're based in Cape Town, as far as I understand, the community has grown quite substantially there. So I think they even do meetups there now and then.
Yeah. We've got a great, pre-COVID, there was a great indie hackers community here. There's a number of people who have been interviewed on indie hackers or been on the podcast had come through. Cortland, the founder of Indie Hackers, actually came through and attended one of the meetups, which was really cool. But yeah, we've got a nice community here. I think we're all missing each other since we've been in lockdown for the last 6 months.
Yeah. So on your website, you talk about freelancing as well, or that you take it up occasionally. So I think there's also, at least for me, sometimes you struggle with the balance between freelancing and working on your own projects, or / working at a company and then freelancing. How do you balance your freelance work with the indie hacking that you do? Do you kind of go, okay, I'm going to take on some freelancing work for about a month and really dedicate to this client for a month, but that's it? Or do you kind of say, okay, I'll do 2 hours, 3 hours a day, and then work on my own stuff? How do you approach it?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not very structured, and it's closer to the latter. So I kind of do a little bit each day. I've gotten pretty good at multitasking, not doing a lot of things at once, but working on many different tasks, unrelated tasks, like throughout the course of a day or a week. And so I kind of structure it that way. My path into it, I would say, I started in a normal job at a company, and then, took the sabbatical, which was a great opportunity to kickstart my indie hacking projects, I guess. And then after I had gone through that initial overhead of just getting those off the ground, I started balancing it mostly just based on financials. And so for as long as my own businesses are not generating as much money as I would like to, then I can sort of supplement that with working for other people and freelancing. And if those are all doing well, then I don't need to do any freelancing. And my goal is certainly to never have to do freelancing and then be in a position where I'm only taking on the stuff that I think is just like super meaningful or super interesting, or there's some other reason to work on it, and
definitely,
and not sort of just having to do it to pay rent or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, no, I can relate. I think that's what we all kind of aim for. So you've got actually quite a few projects on Indie Hackers. The one that interests me the most is the Saas Pegasus project, which comes back to Django, and because it's basically a Django template that can help you hit the ground running.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested, when you were getting started with that project, what was the original need? Did it come out of the work you were doing for your company, or how did that actually come about?
No, it came about from the work, my other side projects that I was doing, and the other personal projects that I was launching. So my first project was this like wedding place card maker, and that was something that I just wanted to do just to prove that I could get something out into the world and then maybe make a few dollars off of it. And it ended up doing sort of better than I expected for a long time. And then after I built that, I thought, well, I want to build something else. And I made another thing. And then I started realizing that, I'm building up this tool set of reusable stuff. And I think a lot of developers who have multiple projects do this, and agencies as well. They start their next project by cutting and pasting the previous project across, and then ripping out all the stuff that wasn't relevant. And you sort of do this organically over time as you as you start to find sort of a structure and a layout and a set of tools and libraries that works well for you. And I thought, well, okay, why don't I just formalize that? And it wasn't necessarily my idea. Like these types of tools existed for other frameworks, and so there's these other sort of like Saas in a box, like template type of things for Rails and for JavaScript and for Laravel. And I looked around and I was like, oh, there isn't one of these for Django. And so I thought, hey, I have this problem, I've got this experience, and it looks like there's a market opportunity here. And so that was kind of how I decided that I should focus on Saas Pegasus and try to turn it into another business.
Yeah, it's a really interesting project because normally, at least I would think, when you're making some sort of software, the end users don't really care what the product is built with. Like if it's just something you used, right? But now you've gone and like double whammied yourself because you're like, okay, I'm going to build something that only Django users will technically understand.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting for me. How do you, what have you taken away from that experience in building something that's so specific for not only a developer, but a developer in a framework?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, on the marketing side, like even though it sounds super niche, there's still plenty of people using Django, such that like, and my aspirations are not to become the next Google or the next Uber or something like that. You know, I want to have a nice, relaxed lifestyle and make enough money to sort of support my family and live off. So, you know, if my goal is to make, let's say, you know, 5,000 USD a month or something like that, that's not, you don't actually need a big market at all. And certainly the community of Django developers would be big enough to serve that need. The other part of it that's been both an upside and a downside, I would say, is that by making the product the code itself, like so the way Pegasus works, you essentially buy a code base. It's a code base generator, so you can configure it how you want to, which features you want to turn on and off and things like that. But then you know, the product is essentially the code. And so the one thing that was really a challenge with that was kind of dealing with the fact that I wanted the code to be really good, you know. So if you're just deploying an application, like you said, your users don't care what's under the hood. You can make your code as messy as possible. You can have all these to-dos and you know, spaghetti code and whatever else. Whereas when the code was the product, it felt really important to me that the code was actually, you know, well structured and clean and thought through. And so I had to educate myself a lot on best practices just to make sure that I wasn't doing anything that was dumb, or, you know, that someone would buy Pegasus and then look at it and say like, hey, like this is crap. Like, why did you write the code this way? So that was a big source of anxiety and something that was hard, but also a really good thing in a way, because it's made me learn a lot more and a lot more focused on code quality. And the other good thing I'll say is like, you know, they say that developers who have their own businesses spend way too much time coding and not enough time doing the less fun side, you know, the marketing and that type of stuff. But for me, since the code is the product, I can actually spend a lot of my time on the code and I'm still making the product better, which is a nice way to sort of self-serve my own interests and how I want to spend my time.
Yeah, that's quite funny. Yeah, on the other sides, like pricing and marketing, what would you say are one or two of the things that you struggled the most on? For me, it's definitely pricing, because most of the time I think, how did they come up with that price? You know, most of the time before I actually went and researched pricing, you just end up thumb sucking a number, and you think, okay, this is pretty valuable, you know. But then once you start actually reading about getting feedback and asking the right questions, and you realize that pricing is actually a science and you can actually do it right.
Yeah.
So I'm curious on Saas Pegasus, what were the things that you really had to dig into?
Yeah. I mean, pricing was definitely one, although one of the nice things about pricing was that for something like, actually for anything really, it's not hard to change your prices. And so the way I've approached pricing for Saas Pegasus was I started on the lower end of the spectrum just because I wanted to get it out into the world. I wanted to get feedback. I wanted to make sure that like someone would buy it. And so I started off pricing it at, I think it was $99. And then over the course of the last year or so since it's been out, I've been slowly raising the prices. So now it's $300, and I might continue to raise them. But what I do is I just raise the price and see how it affects sales. And if I raise the price and sales continue to come in, then I'm like, well, okay, I'll leave it up there. And so I think, I think one common mistake that people make is they release something at a certain price and then they think that they can never change the price because they'll make a bunch of people angry. But I think that's not the case at all. And especially if you're raising prices, as long as you grandfather in people who got in early to an existing price, then it's a pretty low risk thing to do. What's been hard about Pegasus besides pricing? I mean, honestly, the engineering was the hardest part for me. And what, like, it's quite a lot harder to develop a generic code base than it is to develop a specific code base. And so just trying to think about every feature that somebody might want to use and then condense it into like this generalizable, useful thing has been quite tricky. And so, like, for example, the subscriptions functionality is one where there's an infinite number of ways that subscription could be done. You might have monthly or annual plans. You might have a free trial or no free trial. You might have a freemium model. You might have add-ons. And so trying to think like, oh, there's like all these different ways that someone might want to manage a subscription. How can I build something that will cover as much of those use cases as possible without making it overly complicated and difficult to set up and having like a nightmare of config variables and all sorts of stuff. So a lot of those types of issues that have come up that are easy when you have like the specific thing that you want to do, but then when you're trying to build the generic thing for anybody, it become a lot trickier.
Yeah. I'm curious, you don't have to answer if you don't want to disclose it, but I'm sure you looked at some third-party packages for inspiration. I don't know if you looked at the cookie cutter package for Django.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
And what about like other third-party apps like, I don't know, Django all authentication?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Pegasus uses actually both of those. Okay. So not the Django cookie cutter, but the cookie cutter project in general, which is a thing that allows you to do the sort of like config based code templating that I was talking about. So behind the scenes, that is how, like, when you say I want to use subscriptions or I don't want to use subscriptions, it uses cookie cutter to enable and disable that stuff. And it does use all auth for the user management.
Okay.
And I do think that's, like, I think you could say, why would anyone buy Pegasus if it's using just these open source libraries that already exist? But it still takes time and effort to figure out how to stitch everything together in a way that is clean and works for you and looks nice out of the box and these other things. And so, I think even though it's it's for me, it's helpful to use those things because then it's tested, it's well supported by a rich history and a bunch of developers, and it's got all the features you need and everything else. So yeah, a lot of Pegasus is just sort of integrating and providing same ways to work with some of the most popular Django packages.
Yeah. I mean, even just hearing you talking about the pricing, I mean, that to me, that sounds like a nightmare having to configure it for all the different pricing options. And I already get stressed out trying to implement a basic model just with Stripe. So you're always wondering, is this correct? Is this the best way to model this?
Yeah.
So I can appreciate that if it's configured and it's working, then that's what you want. So
yeah,
definitely. So then, other than that, though, do you have any other kind of resources that you could recommend, particularly for indie hackers, but I guess indie hacker developers that they can use either just getting started or just becoming more familiar with building your own projects?
Yeah, I mean, let's see. So, I mean, my favorite advice is to just run. Just like pick a project, build it, and make your way through every obstacle that you face. And so, like for me, what that looked like was, figuring out how to get enough design chops to like put together a reasonable landing page, and then getting enough marketing chops to figure out how to actually get my product into the world once it was built. But like similar to we were talking about the what should you learn after Django, or how deep should you go in Django? I would take a problem-based approach where pick a goal and then start working towards that goal, and then you're going to immediately hit some obstacle and realize, oh crap, I don't know how to deploy this thing, and then okay, go figure out deployment. And for each of those obstacles that you'll run into, there's sort of different resources that I'd recommend. I think one of the books that helped me a lot on the marketing side was a book called Traction by, I think it was Gabriel Weinberg and somebody else. It was the guy who made DuckDuckGo. But that was a really useful book that is written for developers and helps them sort of figure out how to market their products and get them out into the world. And I found that to be a really useful resource that helped me realize that I should be spending more time on the marketing side of things, and then also providing very concrete recommendations and frameworks for thinking about what you should focus on and how you can test it, and then some specific strategies that you can take. So that's a good resource I'd recommend for people who have built something and then want to get it out into the world.
Okay. Well, so where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Czue, CZUE, and then my website is coryszu.com, and I write about sort of my indie hacking journey and everything else there. So those are the best places to follow along.
Awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. It was fun chatting. And if anybody wants to ask me any questions, my DMs are open on Twitter, and my contact info is on my website.